Hi, I'm Jonathan, the Cage Stage Crusader. Welcome to my Fortress of Theology. I'm going to be presenting a video essay explaining the Balkanization that is happening within Canada, the complete fragmentation, and Canada's descent into soft totalitarianism. Canada's past 6 decades have witnessed a profound transformation in its political culture, moral philosophy, and national cohesion. Since the 1960s, a country once rooted in a broadly Judeo-Christian ethos has drifted into a secular relativistic framework that prizes individual autonomy above transcendent truth. This essay examines Canada's political and cultural trajectory from the 1960s up to today in 2025, arguing that underlying philosophical shifts enabled the rise of an expansive bureaucratic regime that increasingly mirrors the functions of slavery, exerting control over thought, property, and even the body. Concurrently, Canada has experienced a form of Balkanization, a fragmentation of culture into ideological, regional, and legal tribes that erode any shred of national identity. These developments are interpreted through the worldview of Francis Schaeffer, the Christian theologian, who warned that abandonment of absolute truth in favor of secular humanism would inevitably lead to chaos or tyranny. Schaeffer's critique of secular humanism and relativism provides a lens to understand how ideas have consequences. The rejection of a Christian foundation in Canada has led to a soft totalitarianism, arbitrary laws, legal pluralism, and a loss of national coherence. In response to this crisis, the conclusion is drawn that only a return to the Christian religion, with its acknowledgement of a transcendent moral order, can provide the basis for a free, just, and stable society. This essay will proceed from historical narrative to philosophical interpretation, and finally to a theological warning with careful attention to key political events such as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, legal reforms, social policies, and cultural shifts that illustrate this thesis. Now, from the Christian roots to a secular revolution, the 1960s to the 1980s, modern Canada was once strongly influenced by Christian principles in its public life. But by the mid-20th century, this foundation had begun to erode. In the decades following World War II, church authority and religious observance in Canada weakened significantly. Historians note that already in the 1920s, the church had lost the battle for the heart and soul of Canada. And by the 1950s, the nation had become a thoroughly secular nation. The 1960s then marked a decisive turning point, a de facto secular revolution that touched every aspect of cultural life. In Quebec, for instance, the Quiet Revolution, the early 1960s, stripped the once dominant Catholic Church of its control over education and healthcare, heralding a new era of state secularism and modernism. Nationally, religious instruction was dropped from public schools and replaced, if at all, by relativistic values education. The death of God in public life created a spiritual void, soon filled by materialism and mass entertainment. Observers note that as God was excised from the public square, spiritual emptiness, irrationalism, and boredom followed along with the never-ending rise of popular culture and cheap entertainment as distractions. Politically, the rise of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1968 embodied this civilizational shift. Trudeau, an intellectual inspired by liberal humanism, introduced a major change in political philosophy and style. His government's policies in the 1960s and 1970s aggressively secularized Canadian law and expanded individual liberties in ways that often conflict with previous moral norms. For instance, Trudeau's 1969 Omnibus Bill legalized contraception, liberalized divorce, decriminalized homosexual acts, and introduced legal abortion within certain limits, encapsulated in Trudeau's famous mantra that the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. The social revolution of the era also included the rise of second-wave feminism, bolstered by the 1970 Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which Trudeau tabled in Parliament. A Toronto newspaper described that report as a bomb packed with explosive potential that would remake society. Indeed, from the 1960s onward, Canadian feminists and other New Left movements sought nothing less than the restructuring of society, overturning traditional views of family, sex, and gender roles. Radical feminist voices even called for the abolition of the nuclear family and envisioned technology replacing natural childbirth as in the name of equality. Such formerly unthinkable ideas illustrate how far the cultural worldview had shifted from its Christian moorings. By the early 1980s, the cumulative effect of these changes was the formal codification of a new Canadian ethos in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When Prime Minister Trudeau, that's Prime Minister Pierre Elliott, patriated the Constitution in 1962, the Charter entrenched individual rights and a vision of Canada as a pluralistic liberal democracy. Ironically, the Charter's preamble acknowledges the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Yet, in practice, the Charter accelerated the secularization of Canadian society. Legal scholar Janet Buckingham observes that after 1982, religion quickly ceased to be a dominant source of public morals, supplanted by individualism and state-defined charter values. Courts wielding the Charter struck down many remaining vestiges of Canada's Christian heritage. In R.V. Big M Drug Mart, 1985, the Supreme Court invalidated the Federal Lord's Day Act, which had enforced Sunday as a day of rest, as an unjustified imposition of Christian religious observance, heralding a new era of official state neutrality towards religion. Similarly, in R.V. Mark Gentler, 1988, the court struck down Canada's abortion law as violating a woman's security of person, effectively eliminating all legal protections for the unborn. A shift that has contributed to what one commentator laments is a persistently high abortion rate in the country. By 1986, the Lord's Prayer was removed from Ontario public schools, and over subsequent decades, Canadian courts consistently privileged secular rationales over religious arguments in public policy, such as in cases on education, sexual ethics, the end-of-life issues. As the Ontario Human Rights Commission noted, the advent of the Charter in 1982 accelerated the secularization of Canadian society, entrenching a move away from religiously informed morals and toward a secular, individualistic ethos. In short, between the 1960s and 1980s, Canada underwent a deliberate cultural revolution from a society that, however imperfectly, acknowledged Christian moral norms to one that embraced secular humanism as its guiding light. The immediate social effects of this worldview shift were dramatic. Writing in the mid-1990s, Christian analyst Ian H. Tengelder cataloged the signs of a nation unraveling under a new relativistic ethos: the collapse of the family, the demand for same-sex benefits, the high abortion rate, and increasingly demand to legitimize euthanasia. A loss of moral consensus was evident in the rise of competing rights claims and identity politics. Canada had developed a clamor for group rights and a passion for equality, pursued through affirmative action and egalitarian social engineering. At the same time, rampant consumerism filled the void of meaning. Canada became a nation of consumers, slavishly worshipping all that is comfortable, pleasant, and entertaining. With the Bible and Christianity deemed irrelevant by today's policymakers and educators, public discourse was cut off from transcendent norms. The result, Tengelder observed, was a spiritually rudderless society. Even many who still identified as Christians had absorbed secular ways of thinking, retreating into privatized faith and adopting secular language because explicitly Christian arguments had ceased to be self-evident to their fellow citizens. By the end of the 1980s, Canadian Christendom, the broad cultural memory of Christian principles, had come apart. With God effectively evicted from public life, Canada was poised to enter the postmodern age. The postmodern turn, relativism, charter values, and the new Canada. By the 1990s, Canada had fully embarked on what Arthur Richard Gwynne famously called the world's first postmodern state. In a postmodern society, relativism reigns. There are believed to be no absolutes and no universal truth, only individual or cultural perspectives. This outlook was increasingly evident in Canadian public philosophy. The federal policy of multiculturalism, first adopted in 1971, blossomed into a defining feature of national identity, or perhaps non-identity. In contrast to the American melting pot, Canada officially encouraged a cultural mosaic in which each ethnic, religious, or ideological group maintains its distinctiveness. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Pierre's son, would later declare that Canada has no core identity, no mainstream, and could be the first post-national state. While Trudeau's 2015 statement raised eyebrows internationally for its radical rejection of common national culture, within Canada it largely reflected an established consensus. Canadian elites had come to celebrate diversity and pluralism as primary goods while viewing assertions of absolute truth or common values with deep suspicion. As one observer noted, postmodernists don't hold to a common morality or shared civic virtues. Indeed, they regard anyone claiming to know objective truth or moral absolutes as tainted by an ugly history of oppression. In 21st century Canada, traditional voices, particularly the Roman Catholic Church and evangelical Christians, found themselves increasingly maligned in media and academia, portrayed as relics of an intolerant past simply for upholding principles that conflict with the postmodern ethos. Under the banner of the Charter and human rights legislation, Canadian lawmakers and courts progressively implemented the new relativistic morality. Sexual permissiveness and redefinition of family became the norm. What Schaeffer called the sexual revolution advanced through the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2005, making Canada one of the first countries to do so, and the normalization of previously taboo behaviors. The breakdown of the family that Schaeffer had flagged as a symptom of worldview shift was palpable. Out-of-wedlock birth rates and divorce rates climbed, while the once near-universal expectation of marriage and child-rearing waned. Legal challenges followed suit. For example, the definition of spouse and parent-in-law was broadened to be gender-neutral. The sanctity of human life was also steadily devalued, reflecting what Schaeffer had warned would be the degrading of human life in a post-Christian culture. After abortion became effectively unrestricted following the more gentler decision in 1988, attention turned to ending life at the other end of the spectrum. In 2016, Canada legalized euthanasia and assisted suicide, euphemistically termed medical assistance in dying, or MAID, initially limited to terminal illnesses in 2021. The regime had expanded to include chronic conditions and was slated by 2024-25 to include mental illnesses and mature minors, making Canada's euthanasia laws among the most permissive or more disturbing and the most disturbing in the world. The ethical boundary long upheld by Judeo-Christian worldview that innocent human life is inviolable had been erased, replaced by a relativistic calculus of individual choice and utilitarianism. As Schaeffer forewarned, secular humanism's arbitrariness provides no firm basis for protecting life. When absolute truth and God-given rights are abandoned, life and death decisions become matters of shifting societal preference. In the economic and political realm, the post-1960s trajectory saw the exponential growth of bureaucratic state apparatus dedicated to managing this new kind of society. The Canadian federal government and provinces built extensive welfare systems, regulatory regimes, and social programs to enforce charter values and promote egalitarian outcomes. The intent was often benevolent, for example, advancing equality for women, minorities, and other historically disadvantaged groups. Yet over time, this administrative state amassed unprecedented influence over citizens' daily lives and choices. Tangelder remarked already in the 1980s that Canadian institutions had become largely shaped by autonomous reason, science, and technology, with policy elites putting enormous faith in technocratic governance divorced from religious or moral constraints. The bureaucracy increasingly took on the role of social engineer, reshaping attitudes via public education, curricula, media messaging, and often government-funded. and the proliferation of commissions and tribunals to monitor compliance with the new orthodoxy on rights and tolerance. One salient example is the network of human rights commissions and tribunals established in every jurisdiction by the late 20th century. These bodies, while ostensibly defending citizens from discrimination, in practice often become enforcers of ideological conformity. They gain notoriety for pursuing cases against speech deemed offensive or against businesses and religious groups whose practices ran against progressive values. Christian pastors were fined for preaching traditional sexual immorality under hate speech provisions. Small business owners were compelled to provide services for events like same-sex weddings, contrary to their faith, or else faced penalties. By the 2010s, the climate in Canada for free expression and freedom of conscience had chilled noticeably. As Francis Schaeffer insightfully wrote, if there are no absolutes by which to judge society, then society is absolute. In Canada, the state, society organized politically, increasingly filled the void left by the loss of Christian consensus, asserting itself as the final arbiter of values and behavior. Without a higher law to appeal to, the government's preferences become authoritative, backed by the coercive power of law. The rise of a bureaucratic slavery, soft totalitarianism in Canada. Though Canada remains a democracy with regular elections and a Charter of Rights, critics have observed an alarming creep of soft totalitarianism, a system wherein an ostensibly free society allows its government to exert control reminiscent of an authoritarian regime, albeit through bureaucratic means rather than overt political terror. The term soft totalitarianism has been used by modern commentators, such as Rod Dreher and others, to describe Western societies in which ideological coercion and state surveillance advance without the need for violent repression. In Canada's case, the expansion of government control over thought, property, and the body has led some to compare the contemporary regime to a form of slavery, not chattel slavery of the past, but a subtler servitude in which citizens are cajoled or compelled to surrender fundamental freedoms. Francis Schaeffer warned of this decades ago, as the memory of the Christian consensus is forgotten. A manipulating authoritarianism will tend to fill the vacuum. Below we'll examine how Canada's governing apparatus has indeed taken on an authoritarian character in key areas. Control of thought and expression. One of the clearest indications of soft totalitarianism is the attempt to control how citizens think and what they are allowed to express. In recent years, Canada has adopted laws and policies that police expression to an unprecedented degree. For example, in 2017, Parliament passed Bill C-16, which added gender identity or expression to protected categories in human rights and hate crime law. While aimed at preventing discrimination against transgender individuals, many, including University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson, argued that the law would compel speech by forcing Canadians to use a person's chosen pronouns under threat of legal sanction. A legal advisor who testified to the Senate on C-16 warned that the government was now effectively compelling people to speak in a certain way, a dangerous precedent of state interference in free speech. The government and its allies insisted that no one would go to jail for using the wrong pronoun. Yet the larger point remained. The law had set a precedent that the Canadian government is now mandating compelled speech. As one analyst put it, in the eyes of many, this crossed a red line, echoing Schaeffer's observation that if there are no absolutes by which to judge the state becomes absolute. By declaring its own new absolutes, in this case fluid gender ideology, and penalizing dissent, the Canadian state was acting as the final authority over thought and language. Moreover, the federal government under Justin Trudeau moved to enforce ideological litmus tests on organizations seeking public funding. A telling incident was the Canadian Summer Jobs Program controversy in 2018. The Liberal government required any charity or business applying for a student wage subsidy to attest to its core mandate respected what the government defined as individual human rights, including reproductive rights, abortion, and sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. In practice, this meant that pro-life or traditional faith-based groups had to either lie or renounce their beliefs to receive funding. Many religious organizations objected vehemently. The problem is the attestation speaks to beliefs in a statement of belief or agreement, explained Julia Beasley of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops likewise protested that this requirement was an obvious and regrettable infringement of freedom and conscience and religion. Despite such objections, Trudeau's government initially held firm, one minister bluntly stating that groups not in line with the Charter, including a woman's right to control her own body, should not receive public funds. Here was the logic of soft totalitarianism on full display. The state would only do business with citizens who mouthed support for the regime's values. Dissenters, even if peaceful and law-abiding, would be economically punished, effectively excluded from full participation in public life unless they conformed ideologically. This episode drew comparisons to the ancient Roman imperial demand for a loyalty oath, burning a pinch of incense to the emperor. Those who refused in conscience to affirm what they did not believe would be cast out. While civil society eventually forced the government to soften the attestation requirement the following year, the incident sent a clear message that the Canadian state sees itself as the arbiter of acceptable belief. Outside the realm of law, the broader culture, often prodded by government funding and policies, has also taken on a censorious propagandistic bent. Media and academia overwhelmingly align with secular progressive ideology, marginalizing contrary voices. The effect is what one writer called a mental sclerosis, in which certain viewpoints, especially those rooted in biblical religion or traditional morality, are demonized to the point of silencing. Jim Witt, even writing in Reformed Perspective, describes how a new dogma around critical theory and identity politics is being imposed. The populace must be trained to think correctly. This training is being done at every level of the educational system, with school curricula rewritten to enforce indigenization, gender theory, and the notion of permanent oppressor-victim classes. Public events now routinely begin with land acknowledgements and other catechisms of group guilt and penance. These performative acts, encouraged by governments, serve as re-education tools, reminding some Canadians of their collective guilt and others of their perpetual victimhood, all in service to an ideological narrative. As Whitten even notes, the underlying assumption is that only the state can ultimately rectify social injustices, and thus the population must be ideologically regimented to accept the state's remedies. This is far from the free contest of ideas expected in a liberal democracy. It is a soft form of thought control. Control of property and economic freedom. Another function historically associated with slavery is the master's control over the product of the slave's labor. Effectively, control of property and economic decision-making. While Canadians are not slaves, the ever-expanding reach of government into economic life has led some to worry about creeping servility. Canada's high tax rates and redistributive economics mean that a large share of the citizens' earnings are controlled and reallocated by the state. By 2023, the total tax burden on the median Canadian family, including income, payroll, sales, and property taxes, hovered around or above 40% of income. A figure that, while supporting a comprehensive social safety net, also represents a significant transfer of property from individuals to government control. More dramatically, recent events show the government's willingness to seize or freeze private property to enforce compliance. The most striking example occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. In early 2022, when truck drivers and supporters converged in Ottawa and elsewhere to protest vaccine mandates and pandemic restrictions, the Freedom Convoy, The federal government took an unprecedented step. It invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history. Under these emergency powers, Prime Minister Trudeau's government ordered banks to freeze personal bank accounts of protest participants and even some who had donated to them, all without a court order or due process. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland announced that crowdfunding platforms and financial institutions were now compelled to report and choke off funds to protesters, equating the peaceful civil disobedience to terrorism financing. Civil liberty groups were aghast. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association noted the government has not met the threshold necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act, which allows government to bypass ordinary democratic processes, warning that the move was an overreach. In 2023, a federal judge agreed there was no national emergency to justify Trudeau's actions. Nonetheless, the precedent had been set. As the Cato Institute reported prior to Prime Minister Trudeau's decision, freezing the bank accounts of protesters had been a strategy only used by authoritarian regimes, not one of the freest nations in the world. The report went on to underscore how dangerous it is to arm the government with powers that can bypass due process, bring targets to their knees through economic incapacitation without trial. Indeed, by leveraging citizens' total dependence on the digital banking system, the Canadian government found a bloodless method of coercion. One cannot survive long if one's assets are frozen. Effectively, the state demonstrated it can bring targets to their knees through economic incapacitation, in lieu of physical chains. In Schaeffer's terms, a society that has made itself absolute will not hesitate to use any tool at its disposal to enforce conformity, even economic excommunication of dissidents. Canada's experiment with punitive economic control was relatively brief. Accounts were unfrozen after public outcry and once the protest dispersed, but the implications remain. Even aside from emergencies, Canadians have grown accustomed to extensive bureaucratic regulation of business, heavy public debts which mortgage the future income of the populace, and eminent domain or environmental laws that can commandeer private property. The Western Standard recently drew a parallel between Canada and Yugoslavia before its collapse, noting that Canada's federal system is held together by massive fiscal transfers and debt, a cohesive mechanism that may falter if economic crisis strikes. In Yugoslavia's case, when the funds ran dry, the country splintered apart. While Canada is not yet at such a breaking point, this analysis highlights how central the state's distribution and potential confiscation of resources has become the national unity. Citizens in wealthier regions like Alberta often feel like economic serfs to central Canada due to equalization payments, feeding growing resentment. Control of property through taxation and transfer has thus become a point of political contention. Some even call it economic slavery to Ottawa. All told, the Canadian state's expansive role in economic life has traded some measure of freedoms for security, and with it, citizens' dependence on a form of clientele relationship to government, relying on it for healthcare, education, pensions, etc., but subject to its terms and ideologies in return. Control of the body. Perhaps the most intimate aspect of a personal liberty is bodily autonomy, the right to control one's own physical person. Yet here, too, the modern Canadian state has asserted dominance in ways that recall the master-slave dynamic, albeit invoked for your own good. During the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 to 2022, Canada imposed some of the strictest public health measures in the Western world. Lockdown orders, curfews in Quebec, bans on worship gatherings and family interactions, and vaccine mandates for travel and employment all became realities. Millions of Canadians found that the government effectively controlled their movements and bodily decisions. One could not board a plane or train without the government-required medical injection, for example, nor in some cases keep one's job. Those who objected on personal or religious grounds to the vaccine or other mandates had little recourse. Many were suspended or fired under government's pressure on employees. While these policies were defended as necessary for public health, they underscored how quickly bodily autonomy could yield to technocratic authoritarianism, when the populace had been conditioned to trust the state's judgment absolutely. Francis Schaeffer's insight is apropos. If there is no absolutes by which to judge society, then society, the state, becomes absolute. In a crisis absent moral restraints, the state's word becomes unquestionable, even to the point of entering your very bloodstream. A significant minority of Canadians experienced this as the almost totalitarian burden on the body, leading to protests like the Freedom Convoy. The government's harsh response, as detailed above, further cemented the impression of a rising soft tyranny. On the flip side of bodily control, Canada's socialized medical system and new therapeutic ethos has granted the state increasing power to dictate life and death. The rapid expansion of assisted suicide, euthanasia, which is really just eugenics, is one example. Healthcare providers, agents of the state in a publicly funded system, now literally administer death to patients, and there are documented cases of state medical personnel suggesting euthanasia to suffering or disabled people who did not explicitly request it. This has led to outrage that vulnerable citizens, the poor, chronically ill, veterans with PTSD, feel subtle pressure that their duty is to die so as not to be a burden. The alarming question arises when the state claims the authority to determine whose lives are worth living. Even if framed as choice, it has not assumed a role. It has not assumed a role tantamount to owning the bodies of the subject. Has it not assumed a role tantamount to owning the bodies of its subjects? Yes, it has. Similarly, in the realm of gender identity, some provincial governments have considered or passed measures limiting parental rights when children express desire to change gender, effectively transferring control of children's bodies to state-approved doctors and courts, should parents disagree with hormone therapies or surgeries. Just look at the case in BC of that father who was charged with someone was like family abuse or neglect or domestic abuse or whatever, because he objected to his daughter, he was like 14, getting cut up and having hormones injected into her. Such developments are a far cry from a society that recognizes parents and individuals as stewards of God-given bodies. Instead, the secular state increasingly positions itself as the ultimate custodian of the body, whether by imposing medical interventions or by facilitating their removal in death or gender alteration according to ideological fashions. In some, though numerous avenues, speech codes, compelled beliefs, economic levers, emergency decrees, and biopolitical mandates, Canada's bureaucratic regime has taken on functions resembling those by which a master controls a slave, thought, labor, physical self. Unlike overt slavery, these controls are shrouded in legalism, technocratic rationales, and the language of rights or safety, but they align with what Schaeffer identified as the inevitable outcome of secular humanism, governmental authoritarianism that replaces God with the state. Without the absolute ethical standard to restrain it, government naturally accrues power to itself. The endpoint, Schaeffer argued, is tyranny, what he termed a manipulating authoritarianism filling the void of lost truth. Canada's experience thus far is a soft form of authoritarianism, soft totalitarianism, in which coercion is often nonviolent and accompanied by smiles, diversity slogans, or emergency justifications, but coercion nonetheless. As one of Schaeffer's notable maxims goes, here is a simple but profound rule. If there are no absolutes by which to judge a society, then society is absolute. One man or an elite fills the vacuum left by the loss of Christian consensus, which originally gave us form and freedom. In Canada, the elite filling the vacuum is the bureaucratic managerial class and judicial oligarchy, which increasingly dictates social norms in lieu of the once widespread Christian consensus that undergirded true freedom. A fragmented nation, ideological, regional, and legal balkanization. Parallel to the growth of soft totalitarianism tendencies, Canada has undergone a fragmentation of its cultural and national unity, a phenomenon akin to Balkanization. The term Balkanization originally refers to the violent fragmentation of the Balkan Peninsula into ethnically defined states in the 19th and 20th centuries. In Canada's context, the fragmentation has so far been largely peaceful, but it is real. The country is fracturing into tribal groupings along ideological, regional, and legal lines, with each tribe holding its own vision of truth and justice. The loss of a shared foundation, religious or philosophical, means that Canada in 2015 often feels like several nations uneasily coexisting within one polity. Take ideological tribes. Culturally and politically, Canada is polarized into camps with incompatible worldviews. Roughly speaking, one can identify a progressive tribe, largely urban, secular, or spiritually liberal, globalist in outlook, and concentrated in media, academia, and government. And then there's the conservative or traditional tribe, which is often more rural, suburban, influenced by religious values, Christian or otherwise traditional, and deeply uneasy with the country's leftward drift. The progressive tribe celebrates the new postmodern Canada with its ever-expanding roster of gender identities, open-door immigration ethos, and emphasis on equity outcomes for protected groups. The traditionalist tribe, by contrast, laments what it sees as the abandonment of common sense, the erosion of family and faith, and the stifling of freedoms under political correctness. In recent years, issues like free speech on campus, gender ideology in schools, COVID health mandates, and climate policy have all become flashpoints that pit tribe against tribe, often with very little middle ground. This ideological schism is exacerbated by social media and segregated information silos such that each faction operates with its own set of facts and narratives. It is not an overstatement to say that Canada now has multiple cultural realities. For instance, one segment of the population marches in pride parades and wears orange shirts to commemorate Indigenous residential schools. With almost religious fervor, another segment quietly teaches its children biblical sexual ethics at home and views Canada's Christian colonizers not as genocidal monsters but as complex figures who also brought positive goods. These visions rarely engage with each other constructively. Instead, they treat one another as existential threats. Everyone is the other and increasingly the enemy, writes columnist Tasha Kirhidin, observing that Canada has become a nation of diasporas, not only in ethnicity but in mindset. People huddle in our enclaves, whether those enclaves are defined by faith, race, or ideology, and meaningful dialogue across the divides diminishes. The result is a rising social distrust and even episodes of violence or vandalism between groups. For example, during the 2022 trucker protests, some progressive activists vilified large working-class protesters as Nazis, while some on the right circulated paranoid theories about globalist conspiracies. The shared middle ground, the idea that despite differences, all Canadians are bound by a common heritage and set of principles, has nearly evaporated. Regional and ethnic fragmentation. Alongside ideological sorting, Canada's famous regional divisions have deepened. The clearest example is Quebec, which for decades has considered itself a distinct society with its own language, French, and civil law system. Quebec nationalism peaked in two referendums, 1980 and 1995, on succession, the latter of which succeeded. 49.4% voted to leave Confederation. While succession was narrowly averted, Quebec won significant autonomy and continues to chart a divergent course on many matters, from aggressively secular policies like the Bill 21 ban on religious symbols for public servants, which the rest of Canada's media decries as discriminatory, to its immigration rules and cultural content laws protecting French identity. In effect, Quebec has already become a semi-sovereign tribe within Canada, its allegiance to the federal system often transactional. Meanwhile, in Western Canada, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan, Resentment towards central Canada's dominance politically and economically has fueled a rise in regionalist movements. Alienation in the West has historical roots in policies like Pierre Trudeau's 1980 National Energy Program, seen as plundering Alberta's oil wealth, and more recently Justin Trudeau's carbon taxes and pipeline delays, perceived to punish the resource-based prairies for the benefit of eastern urbanites. In a 2019 poll showed that support for succession at record highs in Alberta and Saskatchewan. By 2020, a new Wexit separatist party briefly gained momentum, and by 2023, Alberta held a referendum demanding renegotiation of equalization payments. Though full independence remains unlikely in the short term, voices in outlets like the Western Standard explicitly talk of Canada reaching a Yugoslav moment, where an economic crisis could trigger a breakup along regional lines. An article in that publication argued that Canada today exhibits remarkably similar signs of structural fracture to Yugoslavia, noting that Canada is not one nation but many: English-speaking Canadians, Quebec, First Nations, immigrant blocs, including Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim communities. The author suggested that if Quebec were to leave, Alberta would quickly assert its sovereignty, and even envisioned scenarios of provinces and parts of provinces reassembling into new federations or joining the United States. While such scenarios may seem far-fetched, they underscore a crucial point. The bonds holding Canada together have weakened. Shared religion, shared heritage, and even shared economic interest, when each region perceives the other as an exploiter, can no longer be assumed. The federal government has managed to keep the country intact, largely by massive fiscal transfers from richer provinces to poorer year after year, and avoiding any sudden shocks. But this is papered over rather than heal the divisions. Another axis of fragmentation is ethnocultural. Decades of heavy immigration, Canada welcomes nearly 300,000 plus newcomers per year, nearly 1% of its population, have made it one of the most diverse nations on earth. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver are mosaics, where no single ethnic or religious group holds a majority. Diversity can be a strength, but Canada's approach of encouraging each group to retain its distinct identity has meant that ethnic and religious communities often live in parallel societies with minimal integration. As Kieran observes, rather than wrapping ourselves in a common flag, we huddle in our enclaves: Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Jewish, Chinese, Black, and the list goes on. In such enclaves, people may be more attached to the grievances and conflicts of their homelands or their communal identity than to the Canadian national project. The recent importation of foreign conflicts onto Canadian streets proves the case in point. Just look at the almost daily protests of people screaming about the problems in Israel with Palestine. It has nothing to do with us. Shut the hell up, people. In 2023, large protests and even clashes occurred in Canadian cities between diaspora groups supporting opposing sides of the Israel-Palestine war and other overseas disputes. Canada has become what one commentator called a balkanized grievance factory, each group nursing its own historical grudges, seeking recognition or apologies or special treatment. The spirit of multiculturalism, meant to promote harmony, has in some respects curdled into identity politics on a national scale, where every group jockeys for its piece of the Canadian pie, politically, economically, symbolically. The ideal of e pluribus unum, from many one, has given way to pluribus pluribus, from many many. This is tribalism, and it is visibly eroding Canadian cohesion. One particularly fraught facet of this is the relationship with Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Historically oppressed and marginalized, Indigenous communities have won greater acknowledgement of their rights and treaties, culminating in recent legal victories that recognize limited forms of self-government and title to traditional lands. While this is often a matter of justice, it also means Canada now has embryonic legal pluralism, where Indigenous legal orders operate alongside the Canadian state's law. For example, some First Nations effectively control their resources and policing. There is talk of an Indigenous justice system to address the overrepresentation of Natives in Canadian prisons. Additionally, the federal government's embrace of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, hints that Indigenous peoples may gain a veto over certain developments or laws on their territories. In a very real sense, Canada is fragmenting not only between provinces, but within them, as the Western Standard put it. The article noted that recent court rulings have seen First Nations reclaim over $500 million worth of land, and a Sikh sovereignty group established a Khalistan embassy in BC, symbolic moves that underscore multiple loyalties and jurisdictions emerging. While these may not spell the literal end of Canada, they reinforce the reality that Canada is no longer a single nation with one law and one narrative. It is a patchwork of nations within a nation, each with its own laws and exceptions. For instance, Quebec's civil code and language laws, Indigenous self-governance agreements, religious arbitration, and family law at times. The rule of law itself has become fragmented, as the Charter's notwithstanding clause allows provinces to opt out of certain rights. Quebec invoked it to uphold its secularism law. Other provinces have threatened to use it for various purposes. The consequences of fragmentation. This balkanization has serious consequences. Domestically, it undermines national solidarity and the social trust needed for a healthy democracy, as each tribe, whether ideological or ethnic or cultural, primarily seeks its own. Politics becomes a zero-sum battle of will to power among factions. The centrist consensus that once typified Canadian politics fades. Instead, we see a more frequent swings in populist stirrings as groups feel unrepresented. Regionally, tensions strain the Federation's viability. Witness the hardened stance of provinces like Alberta on resource control, or Quebec's continued flirtation with sovereignty. Legally, fragmentation leads to incoherence and conflict of laws. One Canadian's right is another's affront. For example, a religious Jew or Muslim in Quebec finds their freedom curtailed. They cannot wear visible symbols in a government job due to Bill 21, whereas in other provinces no such restriction exists. Similarly, an unborn child in Canada has zero legal protection. But if that same child were a wanted fetus and someone harmed the mother, there is societal outrage, but no law recognizing the fetus's value. A cognitive dissonance reflecting moral fragmentation. In one courtroom, elders speaking of moral absolutes are effectively told their views have no standing. In another, say an Indigenous sentencing circle, traditional values might be given weight. Legal pluralism can acknowledge diversity, but also erode the notion of equality before one law. Francis Schaeffer emphasized that a society without a shared base of truth will tend to splinter. People retreat to similar loyalties, tribe, party, region, because the national idea lacks substance, when no overarching truth or story binds it. He also noted that in such a vacuum, usually either chaos or tyranny results. Canada's fragmentation carries the danger of social chaos, in the sense of disunity and perpetual culture war, which in turn can provoke tyrannical response as an elite tries to impose order. Indeed, one can interpret the rising soft totalitarian measures discussed earlier as an attempt by a secular elite to hold together a fracturing society by force of bureaucratic fiat. Since Canadians no longer have an internal unity of faith or values, the state steps in with speech laws and equity mandates to manufacture unity, or at the very least compliance. This is a fragile substitute for genuine cohesion. As a stark illustration, Justin Trudeau's own words about Canada having no core identity can be seen as both a celebration of diversity and an admission of national nihilism. If a nation truly has no core, it cannot demand sacrifice or loyalty from its people except by material bribery or compulsion. When challenges arise, economic downturn, internal unrest, external threats, such a hollowed-out nation may find its people more inclined to turn on each other or opt out, such as regions leaving. than to stand together. In summary, the unique form of Balkanization in Canada, ideological, regional, legal, cultural, mirrors the fate of other great societies that have lost their unifying vision. Canada's experiment in radical pluralism and relativism is testing whether a nation can survive without any transcendent glue. The early evidence suggests that, as Schaeffer would predict, the center cannot hold. Only a strong return to shared first principles, which in the West's successful history were rooted in the Christian worldview, could restore true unity amidst diversity. Francis Schaeffer's worldview. Ideas have consequences. To understand these developments at their deepest level, one must look at the realm of worldview, the basic ideas through which society understands reality. Francis Schaeffer, who lived from 1912 to 1984, though writing decades ago, offers a prophetic interpretation of Canada's trajectory. Schaeffer's central thesis in works like How Should We Then Live and A Christian Manifesto was that the West was living off the spiritual capital of a Christian consensus that was fast eroding. In that foundation of absolute truth, grounded in the existence of God and the Bible, were removed, Western societies would face a crisis, relativism leading to chaos and chaos leading to authoritarianism. He frequently said that if there are no absolutes by which to judge society, then society is absolute, meaning that without a higher standard of truth or justice, the state or the majority or those in power will simply decide what is right and nothing will be able to limit their power. The loss of absolute truth in Schaeffer's analysis also produces moral fragmentation, each choosing their own values, and a loss of true freedom. Since freedom in the Christian sense depends on an objective moral framework, we are free within the form given by God's law, a concept Schaeffer called form and freedom. Schaeffer furthermore argued that human life and dignity would be jeopardized once the Christian sanctity of life principle was abandoned. He specifically warned that trends towards abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia as signs of a death-orientated culture divorced from God. Examining Canada through Schaeffer's worldview lens, the patterns become clear. Canada's embrace of secular humanism, the philosophy that man is the measure of all things, that reality has no creator, and moral values are human constructions, has indeed led to what Schaeffer predicted: arbitrary law, authoritarian governance, and the devaluation of life. In Schaeffer's words, the shift in worldview was away from a worldview that was at least vaguely Christian in people's memory, towards a worldview based upon the idea that the final reality is impersonal matter or energy shaped by chance. Canada's intellectual and cultural elites made this shift often implicitly in the latter half of the 20th century. The result, a cascade of major ills that Schaeffer enumerated: sexual permissiveness, pornography, problems in public schools, the breakdown of the family, abortion, all of which he said were symptoms of an epistemic shift away from the Christian base. We can tick them off the list in Canada's experience. Public schools, they removed not just prayer but most vestiges of Judeo-Christian content and discipline, and by the 2000s were instead struggling with what values, if any, to instill, as well as social chaos like bullying, drug use, and ideological battles over sex education. Family breakdown? As noted, divorce and cohabitation replaced marriage for many. Birth rates have plummeted below replacement, and single-parent households and fatherlessness have become common, with attendant social costs. Pornography and permissiveness? Those are ubiquitous in Canadian society today, aided by internet technology, and even children exposed to sexual content and gender theories at early ages, something unfathomable under an earlier moral consensus. Most strikingly, the law itself became arbitrary, just as Schaeffer said it would under a materialist relativist worldview. Without belief in God, God's law as supreme, law became merely a tool for social policy and the will of those in power. Thus, Canada's highest law, the Charter and its interpretation, enshrine contradictions that reflect relative shifting values rather than eternal principles. For instance, the Charter asserts the right to life, liberty, security of the person, Yet courts construed this to strike down laws protecting fetal life, finding a mother's bodily autonomy paramount, a value judgment divorced from any absolute beyond personal choice. Later, the security of the person was also invoked to justify euthanasia, autonomy in dying. Essentially, personal autonomy became only absolute, became the only absolute, which is no absolute at all, but simply a preference elevated by the court. As Schaeffer wrote, the material energy chance worldview can only lead to arbitrary, relativistic, culturally grounded law. Exactly this happened. Canadian law on fundamental issues of life, death, marriage, and identity shifted with cultural winds, from criminalizing abortion pre-1969 to celebrating it as a right, from homosexuality being illegal pre-1969 to gay marriage being a constitutional right, from euthanasia being homicide to being healthcare. Regardless of one's stance on each issue, the point is that nothing is fixed. There is no higher principle in Canadian law that certain things like taking innocent life are always wrong. It's all contingent. This is the definition of legal pluralism and confusion. Right and wrong depend on the situation and the perspective of interest groups, not on any consistent rule of natural law or divine law. Schaeffer argued that secular humanism's lack of a base would force Western societies to choose authoritarian order to avoid utter disorder. People would allow this because they crave personal peace and affluence more than truth. To make no decision against the growth of authoritarian government is already a decision for it, he warned. In Canada, we see a populace that by and large accepted or even welcomed increasing government intrusion, for instance, the strict pandemic controls, so long as it was told it was for safety and welfare. This complacency was something Schaeffer decried in the West generally, that people, even in democratic nations, would trade away freedoms bit by bit if it meant keeping their standard of living and avoiding trouble. He famously identified personal peace and affluence as the new values of a post-Christian society, meaning people just want to be left alone in peace and to enjoy material prosperity, affluence, and they will shut their eyes to growing tyranny as long as those are not immediately threatened. Canadian society's relative calm in the face of encroaching speech restrictions, surveillance, and moral revolution can be interpreted in this light. Many Canadians felt that since the economy was fine and one could still watch hockey and go to the cottage, personal peace and affluence, why fight the changes? This attitude, however, merely hastens the slide into soft totalitarianism. As Schaeffer noted, there is a tendency towards authoritarianism. Humanism leads to authoritarianism. The chaos of relativism must be controlled by the elite. In Canada, the elite is the managerial class enforcing charter values and woke norms in the new gospel. And indeed, we now observe that they tolerate no absolute or authority above themselves. Even God's truth must be privatized or suppressed because it challenges the supremacy of the new order. It recalls another incisive Schaeffer quote, "No totalitarian authority nor authoritarian state can tolerate those who have an absolute by which to judge the state and its actions. Christians who affirm biblical absolutes are inconvenient to Canada's soft totalitarian. Christians who affirm biblical absolutes are inconvenient to Canada's soft totalitarian elite, because by holding an authority higher than the state, God's word, they limit the state's claim to total jurisdiction. This explains why evangelical Christianity and Orthodox Catholicism are increasingly in the crosshairs, whether via law, such as compelled speech, hate speech laws, removal of charitable status for churches that won't confirm, etc., or via social opprobrium. On the fragmentation issue, Schaeffer's framework also provides understanding. He noted that when objective truth is denied, society tends to polarize into warring factions, each seeking power, since might makes right when no higher right exists. We certainly see this tribalism in Canada's cultural wars and regional alienation. Additionally, Schaeffer emphasized the importance of worldview unity for national unity. Nation needs a shared vision of what is real and right to hold together. Historically, for Canada and other Western lands, a broadly Christian worldview provided that unity, what Schaeffer called a Christian memory, even for those who weren't individually devout. It set commonly agreed boundaries on behavior, such as murder, perjury, theft, that were wrong. Marriage and the family were good. Human life was sacred, and so on. And a common vocabulary of values, justice, charity, dignity, forgiveness. Once Canada's leadership deliberately threw that overboard in favor of multicultural relativism, the fragmentation we described was the natural result. As Schaeffer put it, when a Judeo-Christian worldview disappears from a culture's memory, many societal troubles result, including arbitrary law, a loss of human freedom, and a sense of despair. Canada's loss of national coherence and despair or cynicism of its citizenry, especially youth, many of whom struggle to find meaning in a country seemingly unmoored, bear this out. Crucially, Schaeffer did not diagnose these issues merely to lament them. He urged a return to foundations. He argued that only a return to acknowledging true truth, the truth of the Christian God and his revelation, can save freedom. In his Christian Manifesto, he wrote that despite America and by extension Canada not being a covenant Christian nation, a Christian worldview provided much of the foundation for our form of government and its attendant freedoms. Therefore, secular humanism leads inevitably to authoritarianism, arbitrary law, the degrading of human life, and the removal of religious freedom. Precisely what we have catalogued in Canadian developments. Conversely, the biblical worldview once gave rise to the idea that the state is under God and law, not absolute in itself. Each individual has God-given rights because he is made in his image. And that moral truth is not decided by majority vote, but by divine standards, which restrains the majority of rulers from becoming tyrannical. Remove that and you get what we have, a humanist state that increasingly brooks no opposition and no higher judge over it. The only firm foundation, Christianity as the key to freedom and unity. The analysis above paints a sobering picture of a Canada that has lost its way, sliding into the soft totalitarian regime and splintering into tribal fragments because it's cut itself off from the transcendent source of truth and morality. In concluding, it must be asserted that only a return to the Christian worldview can restore what has been lost. This is not to advocate a theocracy or a church-run state. Schaeffer himself opposed theocracy, but rather to recognize that the principles necessary for a free, just, and stable society are ultimately grounded in the Christian faith. No other foundation has proven strong enough to uphold these principles over time. Why Christianity, though? Well, first, human dignity. The Christian doctrine that all humans are made in the imago Dei, image of God, is the strongest possible basis for inalienable human rights. It undergirds sanctity of life, ethic from a conception to a natural death, true racial and social equality, since all share in the image of God, and all are equally fallen in sin and equally able to be redeemed, and the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. Canada's secular humanism pays lip service to human rights, but without God, these become merely conventions, easily revoked or reinterpreted, as we saw with the unborn children, or infirm adults being excluded from the right to life. Only if rights are endowed by a creator, as the American founders recognized, are they secure against the state. Canada's charter even hints at this by invoking the supremacy of God at the outset, a nod to the source of authority beyond the state that has been ignored in practice. Legal scholars, judges consider it dead words of they're there to shut people up. They don't serve any purpose. They have no legal binding power at all. They're meaningless in law. Reviving a genuine acknowledgement of God's supremacy would mean that the state is not God. It would reestablish healthy limits on government. Caesar is answerable to a higher king. This is crucial for freedom, as Schaeffer noted. The state, as all of life, stands under the law of God, and when it commands what is against God, it has abrogated its authority and become tyranny. A population that believes this will not easily surrender their freedoms of worship at the altar of government. They will insist the state's role is limited to punish wrongdoers and protect the good, as Scripture says, Romans 13, 1-4. Not to be an ideological master over every facet of life. Reintroducing that mindset in Canada, even among non-Christians, would help roll back the soft totalitarian creep. Second, absolute truth. Only the Christian worldview offers a coherent absolute truth, that God exists, that his character defines good and evil, and that truth is knowable through revelation and reason. This provides a firm reference point by which to judge laws and social norms. Christianity is the truth, Schaeffer emphasized, true to reality, not just your truth or my truth. With this foundation, Canadians could rebuild a moral consensus on key issues. For example, that stealing is wrong, honesty is good, marriage is between man and woman, children should be protected, and so on. Even those who personally reject the faith can benefit from living in a society where law and virtue have objective grounding. The current relativism provides no guide for youth, no compass for policy. It's like a ship adrift. The return to belief in truths for all people at all times would restore confidence and direction. It would also importantly allow for meaningful dialogue. If truth exists, people of goodwill can seek it together, rather than retreat into tribes of subjective truths. Canada's fractured ideological tribes could begin to communicate again on shared assumptions, for example, agreeing that justice matters, then hashing out what justice is in light of higher standard, rather than just shouting past each other. Third, unity and reconciliation. The Christian message uniquely reconciles various groups by transcending them. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. This spiritual truth manifested historically in how Christianity moderated national and ethnic divides. In Canadian history, it was often in the church that English and French, Indigenous, European, found some common ground, imperfectly to be sure, but there was grievous failure, and there were grievous failures, but also notable successes of brotherhood. In contemporary times, a revival of Christian faith across different communities would build bridges. For example, immigrant Christians from various countries and historic Canadian Christians share a deeper bond in Christ that can overcome cultural differences. The gospel also brings repentance and forgiveness, which are the only lasting basis for healing historical wounds, such as those between settlers and Indigenous people. Critical theory and perpetual grievance yield only endless anger. Christianity offers a way forward through confession of wrongs and extending forgiveness, seeing even one's enemy as a potential brother in Christ. Canada's current approach to grievances, apologies without end, financial payouts, land acknowledgements, but little heart change, does not truly reconcile. A Christian revival, however, could foster true reconciliation, acknowledging sin, and Canada has had sins, mistreatment of Indigenous people, racism, you name it, but also moving beyond it through the cross, which both condemns evil and offers redemption to evildoers. In practical national terms, this means that not only a return to Christian-informed ethic of love, grace, and shared higher loyalty to God and his kingdom can glue the fragments of Canada back together in authentic unity. Finally, liberty with order. The genius of the Christian worldview is that it provides a balance of freedom and form. Schaeffer often explained that biblical truth gave a framework form that is not arbitrary, within which people have genuine freedom to live, create, and make choices. This stands in contrast both to authoritarianism, form without freedom, and to chaotic license, freedom without form. Canada today is oscillating between the chaos of relativism, no shared form, and the authoritarian impulse to impose order, state overreach. Christianity offers a third way of voluntary societal adherence to God's form, the moral law, the design of creation, that permits maximum liberty without anarchy. For instance, if people govern themselves according to the Ten Commandments, don't steal, don't kill, don't lie, and so on, you do not need a massive police state. People are self-governed under God, what one writer called moral self-government. But if that inner governance is gone, external government grows. Alexis de Tocqueville observed this about America in the 1830s. Religion fostered virtue, which made freedom workable. The same is true for Canada, or any society for that matter. Without a revival of virtue born of faith, Canadians will either descend further into lawless division or accept more and more state control to keep a semblance of order. Neither is desirable. The only path that safeguards both societal order and individual freedom is this Christian-informed path of moral citizenry under a limited government. This path built the best of Western legal tradition, including British common law and parliamentary democracy within Canada, which Canada inherited. These institutions assumed a Christian worldview, such as dignity of the person, the fallibility of man, hence checks and balances, the importance of truth and testimony, and so on. Jettison the worldview and the institutions malfunction, become tools of oppression or absurdity. Therefore, the call is for Canada to rediscover its soul, not in maple syrup and hockey, but in the truths that once underlie its motto, "He shall have dominion from sea to sea," Psalm 72, verse 8, and its laws. Practically, this could mean space for Christianity to flourish again in the public square, protecting religious freedom robustly, allowing Christian education and charities to operate according to conviction, and even welcoming respectable Christian influence on policy, such as secular ideologies are currently influencing policy. It means leaders humbly acknowledging that ultimate authority belongs to God, not the government. An attitude seen, for instance, when leaders call displays of prayer in crisis, or at least refrain from hubris and social engineering. It means reorientating laws to protect the weak and the voiceless, unborn, elderly, minorities, because they bear God's image, and restraining the powerful, government and corporate, because they too are under divine judgment. It means encouraging the stabilizing institutions ordained by God, like family and church, rather than undermining them. In short, it means reversing the experiment on building a nation on relativistic sand and returning to the solid rock of transcendent truth. Historically, whenever nations have experienced cultural decay, akin to what Canada is facing, only a spiritual awakening turned the tide. The soft totalitarianism and fragmentation can be rolled back, but not by human cleverness alone. It requires widespread change of the heart. The Christian gospel, which changed the brutal Roman government into a civilization that at least aimed for charity and virtue, is the prime candidate for such renewal. As Schaeffer wrote, the church must show what happens when a Judeo-Christian worldview disappears and demonstrate how Christianity provides the basis for human freedom and flourishing. This essay has attempted to show the first part, what happens when the Christian worldview disappears. Canada 2025 is what happens. The second part, providing the cure, lies in representing the claims of Christ lovingly and persuasively in Canadian society. Only through a return to Jesus Christ, the truth who sets us free, John 8:32, can Canadians hope to secure both liberty and order, both diversity and unity, both justice and mercy in their nation. To conclude, Canada's political and cultural trajectory from the 1960s to the present confirms Francis Schaeffer's warnings that ideas have consequences. The idea that there is no God's eye truth, no overarching moral law, has birthed a regime that increasingly controls minds, resources, and bodies, ironically enslaving people under the banner of liberation. It has also shattered the country into factions lacking a common vision. Yet there is hope. The Christian idea, the truth that the God who is there has spoken and gives a foundation for life, has equally far-reaching consequences, positive ones. Those consequences historically included the rule of law, human rights, national purpose, and restrained government. Canada can have those blessings again, but only by reclaiming the source. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people, says Proverbs 14:34. In rejecting its Christian heritage, Canada chose the path of disgrace, seen in the moral confusion and creeping tyranny, disregarding us, disgracing us now. But in turning back to righteousness, a righteousness rooted in ourselves, but not in ourselves, but in Christ, Canada may yet find a way out of the current crisis. Indeed, nothing less than a return to the Christian religion as the transcendent basis of society will suffice and to rebuild freedom, justice, and stability from sea to sea. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something. Like, subscribe, drop a comment, question. Talk to you later. Bye.